All right, so let us begin formally for today. Thank you all for joining us. Today, Classrooms Without Borders, in coordination with Tali Nates, the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, Madene Shachar, director of Talking Memory online lecture series and the international education programs from the Ghetto Fighters House, Esther Toporek Finder, member of the GSI Coordinating Council, Generations of the Shoah International, and in partnership with Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Research Center and Education Center of Florida, is delighted to have you join us for our series today, The Holocaust as an Interdisciplinary Tapestry. Today's session number 5 will feature Dr. Will Meinecke Jr. on German professionals and the Holocaust. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders is more than just a name. It represents a powerful vision of breaking down the walls that confine education within traditional boundaries. It is a testament to the belief that learning should have no limits, that knowledge and understanding can transcend geographical, cultural, and historical barriers. We express our deep gratitude for the support you've provided over the years, especially these past 3 years, as we've successfully conducted 446 virtual programs engaging over 75,000 participants. These programs have reached nearly 60.
My system's frozen.
I think it's Ellen. So maybe I'll take over, Jackie. I apologize, Ellen's system just froze. She will join us a little bit later. But just from me, Tali Nates, the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, and from the 3 centres in South Africa, in Durban, in Cape Town, and Johannesburg, I just want to welcome you and welcome you all. It's wonderful to have Holocaust survivors with us, and teachers and academics, and you, members of the public from all around the world, joining us today for this partnership series with Classroom Without Borders, with the Ghetto Fighters House, with Generation of the Shoah International, and with Liberation 75. And as you know, because this is already our fifth time together, we look at each month at a different angle, different part of the tapestry of how do we know what we know about the Holocaust. And we started with psychiatry, we looked at education, we looked at the law and Nazi hunting after the Holocaust. And we looked also today at the issue of the professions, the different professions, and how they come together to make us understand how ordinary people, doctors, lawyers, teachers, civil servants, military officers, all the professions, how they together were such an important part of what we know of Nazi Germany and of what we know of the Holocaust. And to do that, there is no one better than my friend, my colleague for many, many years, Dr. William Frederick Meinecke Jr. from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We chatted before, and Will came to South Africa a few times. He worked in all 3 centers in South Africa. He worked with many of you across the United States, across the world, really. And we learned so much from him over the years, and looking very much forward to learn from Will tonight. Will is, of course, part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum since 1992, but for the last 20 years, he worked with law enforcement officers, judges, prosecutors, and attorneys in the law enforcement and society lessons of the Holocaust training program, which really put him in a position to speak to us about this topic with great authority. He's currently working in the museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education on programming for the initiative on the Holocaust and professional leadership. And I hope that Will share with us after today's session with some of the resources that he's working with in the past years. As always, please write your questions, your comments to Ellen. She will share with me. Will present for about 45 minutes, and then we will have a very lively discussion with your questions and with your comments. As always, the program will take about 75 to 90 minutes, and I hope that you can stay with us throughout. And I will drop Will's full bio in the chat. Will, thank you for joining us. The microphone is yours, and we are looking forward to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Tali and Ellen. It's my pleasure to be part of this series. I'm really excited about it, actually. You know, I've been a historian of German history at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. for more than 30 years now. My area of expertise is from the perpetrator end of things. I really examine what's happening in Germany, what happens amongst German professionals, what happens amongst the Nazi German state. And I work with a great group of museum educators at the museum. We lead seminars, professional seminars for American professionals, where we encourage them to look at their counterparts in Nazi Germany at the time, in the past, and look at the dilemmas that they face and the choices that they made at that time as a way to examine their role in our society today, the importance of upholding professional ethics, to beware of taking the easy path for security, and above all, you know, to really look at the dangers of going along just to get along, right? Let me share my screen with you so you can see some of the great images I brought from DC, Europe, and also from our colleagues in Israel. Just takes a second, sorry. So I wanted to, you know, look at German professionals and really try to narrow it down to just look at, you know, a few professions, because we have very limited time today. I really want to look at the law enforcement professionals, that's this group here, judicial professionals, medical professionals, and military professionals, and really, you know, start by framing it in a way that fits it all into the progress of German history. The professions have a long history in Germany. Doctors, lawyers, government officials, they believed they were privileged in German society because of their position, their service to the state, and their service to the German people. They had a strong professional ethic, also a really strong sense of independence as neutral professionals. But the Nazis were also adept at corrupting and redirecting that ethics for their own ends. Now, don't get me wrong, there were true believers amongst the members of each of these professions, really of any professions. These were people who fully bought into Nazi ideas and goals. These ideologues were key in shifting professional ethics towards achieving Nazi goals in a language that professionals could understand. An example I can give you from my own work in law, in German law, is that, you know, the Nazi ideologue in the legal profession, one of them was Roland Freisler, who we know as the bloody judge of the People's Court in Berlin from 42 to 45. But before that, he was Undersecretary in the Ministry of Justice. And he's key in shifting the normal standard that we would call community standards, that the law has to be seen in light of what's acceptable to the community as part of what's acceptable to the community, to shifting it towards what the Nazis called gesundes Volksempfinden, sound popular judgment. And basically, he proposed that, look, you need to look at the law, especially laws that existed before the Nazis came to power, and see if the outcome of applying that law makes sense after the Nazi rise to power in 1933. And if it doesn't, then you need to adjust the application of that law in a way that most people would find acceptable, right? And it's really Roland Weiser that says, look, there's a mystical connection between the German people and its leader, Adolf Hitler. So if you're going to depart from the letter of the law and cite sound popular judgment of the reason why you're doing it, then you better be able to cite public statements by Adolf Hitler. Because as far as Roland Weiser was concerned, that community ethic shifting into sound popular judgment meant that you had to decide the case the way Hitler would decide a case, right? I don't think it's really fruitful to look at the ideologues in each of these professions. Instead, we want to emphasize those professionals, that were in the profession when the Nazis came to power in 1933. They continued to work for the Nazi German state. They didn't see any reason not to. And look at the dilemmas and the decisions that they made and how they then contributed to the stabilization of the Nazi system and ultimately to the racial agenda of the Nazi racial agenda, and contributed to the crimes of the Nazi German state. Now, I want to show you basically very specific professional groups: law enforcement, the judicial, medical, and military. And then at the end, because I really want to emphasize that these professions, they have power, they have agency, they make decisions. It may be a Nazi dictatorship, but the Nazis are dependent on the talent of the professionals that administrate the country for them, right? I want to look at 5 German professionals that made different choices that didn't have any consequences for the decisions that they made, but they definitely made different choices than what was expected of members of the profession. And I really want to argue that if you have agency, then you actually have responsibility for the decisions that you make. You can't argue away or rationalize away agency, the power to make a decision and to make a difference, regardless of the system that you're working in, right? I want to start by looking at the context within which these professions are looking at the new state. Now, I tend to use Nazi German state all the time because I think this image illustrates it precisely. The Nazis didn't get everything their own way. They started as a compromise state between Nazis and the German administration. So professionals, the powers that be in Germany at the time, they agreed to work together to administrate Germany. At the time, Germany's in an economic, political, and constitutional crisis. With the Great Depression, Germans began to vote for radical solutions. It meant by 1932 in Parliament, the Nazis and the Communists, the 2 most radical parties, anti-democratic, by the way, could vote as a bloc to block all legislation. So the government is paralyzed. Parliament cannot function. And in that vacuum, the power of the presidency becomes more important. He uses Article 48, which grants the power to the president, seen here as President von Hindenburg, not a Nazi. He's a war hero from World War I. He's got a mandate from the German people to solve the crisis. He was elected in 25, re-elected in 1932. He's figuring out how can he restore a majority for the government in Parliament. And his advisors have convinced him the best way to do that would be to appoint Hitler chancellor. But chancellor in a government dominated by non-Nazis. The other members of the government are mostly members of the Nationalist Party, the German National People's Party, or nonpartisan professionals in the administration. So when you look at this image, this is the day of Potsdam, when the Nazi German state is heralding their supposed connection back to Imperial Germany, that all the traditional values of Germany are going to be recognized in this new state. And that Hitler is publicly humbling himself to Hindenburg. And he has to do this because the Nazis only have about 1/3 of the seats in Parliament. They can't rule by themselves. He's dependent on President Hindenburg's power to rule by decree to get anything done. And by bowing to the president, he's signaling to the population at large that, yeah, he's a man of action. He's radical. He'll find some solution. But at the same time, he respects traditional German values, traditional German society, and he will work within the system. And regardless of what you think about this situation, this public act of humiliation for Hitler grants his government legitimacy. Because most Germans look at this and say, well, Hindenburg's legally elected. He's elected by the universal suffrage of the people. He's the president. He's got all the powers of the presidency, and he's appointed Hitler chancellor. So that government must be legitimate. And if the government's legitimate, then don't I have a responsibility to follow the edicts of the government? That's the conundrum here, because Hitler knows this is a trap. This is an attempt to get him to represent the interests of the conservative elite in Germany, the nationalist conservative elite in Germany, not to enact a Nazi agenda. But he's hoping something will happen that will give him real power independent of President Hindenburg. And he doesn't have long to wait. It's just about a month later, the Reichstag building, the German parliament building in Berlin, is destroyed by fire under mysterious circumstances. Right away, Hitler proclaims that this is an act of communist sabotage, that this is a signal for a communist uprising against the Nazi German state. Even he calls the state the government of national reconciliation, right? It's not a Nazi state, it's a compromise state. He goes to President Hindenburg and says, this is a communist act. They're going to be marching on the government. I need emergency authority to restore order. Hindenburg agreed. He issued the president's decree under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution for the protection of the people in the state. Who could be against a decree that protects the people in the state? What it did was vastly expand the independent authority of the police to question, to arrest, to restore order, and to empower the federal government to take over any state administration if they thought the state administration wasn't moving quick enough to restore order. So it gave Hitler's government vast opportunities to enact policies independent of Hindenburg that favored then a Nazi dictatorship. Now, most Germans expected that this emergency decree would expire once the emergency was mastered, right? Instead, this is a key element of the Nazi dictatorship, and it remains in force down to 1945, when the Nazi state collapses at the end of World War II, right? So the context we have here is that most professions regard the state as legitimate, that Hitler's leading the state, but he doesn't have everything his own way. He's got to get the non-Nazi ministers on board with what he wants to do before anything can happen. And Hindenburg is waiting in the wings to step in if Hitler goes too far too quickly. And at the same time, there is a sense of national emergency that the other party that was gaining strength at the end of 1932, the communists, that they are then acting against the government, this government of national reconciliation, and they have to take decisive action to stop it. And that means, unfortunately, using measures that violate democratic principles. So if we look at the first profession, the law enforcement profession, now we have a long history of the program for American law enforcement officers at the museum in Washington. And this is an image that fascinates them because they're looking at this and they see basically the professional police officer here on the left. He's a member of what they call the SHUPO, the order police. These are police units of the big cities, basically. And he's walking the beat arm in arm with a paramilitary fighter of the Nazi Party, an SS officer. The public sees that the police officer is giving orders to the SS man, and the SS man is carrying out the orders. The policeman feels like he's got his authority reinforced after almost 12 years of shrinking budgets, of budget cuts, of no promotions, no new equipment, no new training, struggling to master control of the streets with limited personnel. He suddenly has help. Now, at the same time, I have to say that there's no pressure on law enforcement. Pressure is that there's no requirement that law enforcement join the Nazi Party or the SS. And right down to 1945, there are tens of thousands of police officers that never joined the Nazi Party, that never joined the SS, that still see their role as neutral professionals enforcing the law. After all, police aren't usually responsible for political decisions. They're responsible for implementing political decisions. And that's how they see their role. So they look to the Nazi state to help them find order in the streets. And here they use the extra authority they have to really crush the opposition. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But they get extra manpower, they get increased budgets, they get new equipment, they get new training. There's some advantage to being a law enforcement officer in a police state. And that's what they're looking for, that they think the Nazis are going to be decisive about controlling crime, about controlling the streets, and that they could then have an orderly society rather than every time there's an election, there's near civil war in the streets of Berlin and other major cities in Germany. So they have that shared interest in restoring order and strengthening the police forces so that they could then get respect for law enforcement as respect for the law by stiffening and toughening the enforcement of it, right? In the expansion of police authority, that means police can stop anybody they want to stop, search anybody they want to search, question anybody they want to question, arrest anybody they want to arrest, and then incarcerate them in a concentration camp without any kind of judicial review. They used this authority to crush the opposition in 1933. They arrested about 30,000 Germans, opponents of the Nazi regime, mostly communists, socialists, trade unionists. They're the first arrested without warrant. They're the first incarcerated without trial. But eventually that expands until it includes more and more people so that it becomes the dominant opposition to the opponents of the Nazi German regime. But in 1933 and in the pre-war years, the judiciary is still primarily responsible. So what then did this willingness of law enforcement to work with the Nazi German state, what impact did that have on the enactment of the Nazi racial agenda? Well, this is a great example here. This is a police officer, Wolf Heinrich Graf von Helldorf. He's police chief of Berlin, but he wears two hats. He's also the SA leader for Berlin. And he's working closely with Joseph Goebbels, who sets the political goals of the police. And basically, he sees the police as a way to force Jews to leave the city. Now, the Jewish community in Berlin is the largest Jewish community in Germany. In 1933, they had about 160,000 Jews in Berlin and a population of about 4 million. And basically, Helldorf orders the entire German police force, wearing his hat as chief of the German police, and says, look, within the limits allowed by law and allowed by policy, anytime any police action involves Jews, you should rank up of enforcement to the absolute limit that the law allows. So if you have the option of giving a ticket or a fine or an arrest, go for the arrest. If you have a traffic stop where you have the option of giving a warning or a ticket or seizing the automobile, seize the automobile. And basically, he's telling his officers, you're going to be responsible to me personally to enact this. And he's hoping that this harassment then would lead to Jews leaving Berlin, so that eventually Berlin would be without Jews. So that's the political goal. And law enforcement here is staying within the law, but they're trying to reduce the discretion that law enforcement had by saying, you no longer have the option less than the most severe option. You have to enact the most severe option when it comes to the Jewish population in the city. And that's because our intent is to harass them to the extent where they choose to leave Berlin and go somewhere else. Not very successful. Another way they contribute to the Nazi racial agenda is by not intervening. And this becomes really tricky because, there are major events where the Nazi party has organized attacks on the Jewish community in Germany right from the very beginning. In 1933, it's the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses and services, April 1st, 1933. 1935, through the whole summer of 1935, there are a series of actions where the Nazis have organized public humiliation campaigns against mixed confessional couples, Jews and Christians, along the lines saying that this should be illegal, this shouldn't happen. The police don't intervene to stop that from happening. They just try to maintain order on the fringes of that. And then thirdly, I think the most crass example, as you see here, is during Reichskristallnacht, a series of November pogroms against the Jewish community in Germany, where in a night of rage, they destroy synagogues, they destroy Jewish-owned stores, they ransack Jewish-owned homes. And then they post a police officer who's not stopping violence, but he's trying to prevent them, the public from stealing property, from looting. Because the Nazi German state regards Jewish-owned property or inventories in Jewish-owned stores as being state property. because their logic is in Nazi ideology that Jews have stolen what they have from the non-Jewish public. And in order to protect that property for the German state, they post the police to prevent looting. Now, where it gets tricky for law enforcement is they have to decide whether something is authorized by the Nazi Party or not authorized by the Nazi Party. Because if it's not authorized by the Nazi Party, then they intervene and stop any kind of public violence, right? Where it's authorized by the Nazi Party, they officially ignore what's happening. In fact, we know of cases where Jews have called the police on Kristallnacht and said, help me, there are people at my door trying to break into the house. And the police call center asks them, are you Jewish? And when they answer yes, they hang up. So it's part of the lack of civil defense for the population that's no longer extended to the Jewish population, right? They have no civil recourse in the society any longer. There's also more direct involvement of law enforcement in the persecution of Jews, especially during the war, with the beginning of the deportations of Jews from Germany in the fall of 1941. The image here shows the deportation of Jews from Würzburg. It's one of 6 deportation actions in Würzburg. And they mobilized the police battalion in Würzburg to deal with the deportation. After all, police have expertise in crowd control. And here they're utilizing the officer you see here. He's a member of the barracks police. Barracks police were large uniformed formations that were stationed in major cities that could be used to restore order in any kind of big civil unrest or any kind of big natural disaster, sort of like in America, the National Guard. But in Germany, it's a police formation that are stationed in these big cities, and they mobilize them then to organize the deportation so that it's seen as very orderly, very correct. But they're deporting people from their homes in a time of war to an uncertain fate in the East. Now, certainly these officers must have heard rumors about massacres in the East. We know that soldiers coming home from leave from the Eastern Front have talked about hearing about massacres or seeing massacres themselves, or even with photographs of massacres. So it's clear that it's an uncertain future, right? And this is going to be a hard image. So I tried not to make it too harsh, but this is the Holocaust. This involves the state systematically killing people here. And here we see in German occupied Poland, where then these same kind of police officers, these barracks police, also the order police in the major cities, they're involved in the systematic killing of the Jewish population. Here, this is one of a series of photographs in Miszos, Poland, where they're doing a killing action for women and children in the ghetto. And here they've just rounded them into a trench, a ravine nearby, and they're preparing to kill them. So, scholars understood that the mobile killing squads alone, the Einsatzgruppen, weren't enough to kill 2 million people during the invasion of the Soviet Union. They had to have other manpower. And at first we thought, well, they recruited locals. And they did recruit locals, auxiliaries, to help them in the killing process. What became clear later, in later research, was that they also used these police battalions that were transferred into the occupied territories as occupation forces. They used them also in killing operation against Jews. They needed some 70,000 uniformed German police involved in the killing in Eastern Europe. So law enforcement and the SS are direct perpetrators of the Holocaust. They are involved. There's no way around it, right? If you look at law, the law is really my academic field. I did a biography of the German Supreme Court in the Republic and under the Nazi regime. And, you look at how they reacted to, the Nazi German state. Well, lawyers are in crisis here. This is a rally of thousands of jurists during their yearly Congress in Leipzig before the Supreme Court in Germany, organized in this case by the National Socialist League of Law Guardians, the WB. And the banner across the Supreme Court building says, the German people receive German law through the National Socialists. So through National Socialism, German people get German law, i.e. German law devoid of Jews. And part of the problem for lawyers especially is overcrowding. The one thing about the Republic is that it opened the professions to new social classes. And that meant that the number of lawyers in the Republic about doubled in the 12 years of the Republic. While working with the Nazis, they reduced the number of lawyers by a quarter and quadrupled their average income. So clearly there's an advantage here. They looked to the Nazi state to solve that issue, to solve that problem. And the removal of Jews from law, from not just the legal profession, but also the judiciary, meant that positions opened up in the major cities, and opportunities for advancement and promotion were available. So there were advantages to the judicial community for working with the Nazi German state, especially since they thought that they could, again, same thing with law enforcement, that the Nazis could foster a public respect for the law if the law was uniform and united and used as a way to have a harsh kind of justice so that people would respect the law and would follow the law, right? So just because Hitler preferred direct police action under executive authority, it doesn't mean he neglected the normative state, right? There had to be changes amongst the judicial system in order to Nazify it, and what the process what the Nazis called coordination or Gleichschaltung, right? That's the actions of these ideologues within the profession that then change enough of the values of the ethics of the profession so that it matches Nazi goals, right? And Nazi means. And this was a surprise for me because, I listened to Nazi rhetoric when I was first got out of undergraduate school. And Nazi rhetoric was that Hitler was going to march on Berlin and he was going to seize power, and then blood would roll on the streets of Berlin. But when push comes to shove, because of this compromised state, because of the need to work with established professionals in the government and the administration, and President Hindenburg, it worked through law, and that took an extended period of time. It means you also had to have lawyers to draft the legislation. They had to have lawyers to enforce and enact the legislation, not just write the legislation. And it takes a longer period of time. It took almost 2 years. Here are laws. I think these are the 10 basic laws that transform democracy into dictatorship. And amongst them, you can see that 2 of them are decrees and the rest of them are laws. But the important thing is to notice is that the laws start when Parliament votes an enabling act, which gives its legislative authority to the government. So all those laws after the enabling act are laws that are enacted by the right cabinet. So Hitler's just got to convince a non-Nazi minister that his thinking is right and get them to countersign a law and publish it, and then he's got a law. And we'll find amongst these laws weeding out of anti-Nazi agitators from the civil service and Jews from the law for the reestablishment of professional civil service, a law against other parties, so the Nazi party becomes the only legal party in Germany, a law for the reconstruction of the Reich, which destroys the federal system and makes it all one national unitary state. That's extraordinarily complex, and that took a long period of time, where a Bavarian official and administration is made into a national German administration and official. Hindenburg eventually dies, and Hitler is able to assume the powers of the presidency. But that also then required a referendum, so popular consent that Hitler should assume the powers of the presidency. So at the end of December 1934, Hindenburg dies in August 1934, you have then the basic elements of the Nazi dictatorship in place. In the middle of all that is anti-Semitic legislation, because the Nazis insist that their constituents are only non-Jewish Germans. So literally every element, every part of the German government passes anti-Semitic laws. And this is really important here because law was a major entryway into government auspices. Half of all civil servants were lawyers, and half of all lawyers were civil servants, right? And they're drafting anti-Jewish laws at every level of government, every level of administration, even some sort of non-governmental entities, like the lottery. These are just some of the 400 pieces of law that banned Jews step by step from public life in Germany, and also then constricted their private activities in Germany at the same time. This really set out that Jews were other. Jews were different from non-Jewish Germans. This is one of those actions in the summer of 1935 that I mentioned before, where Nazi agitators are demonstrating for a change in status for Jews in Germany, where the Nazis campaigned in the Republic on separation of the races, insisting that Jews are a priori a race, not a religion, and that they needed to be separated from Germans defined under the law as German culturally and non-Jewish by religion, right? What comes from this is national pieces of legislation too, the so-called Nuremberg race laws. The first was the Reich citizenship law, which defined in law who was to be considered Jewish and who was considered to be an Aryan German. And basically, and this shows the bankruptcy of legal thinking here, of racial thinking here, the law says that if a person's grandparents, 3 or 4 grandparents, were members of the Jewish religious community, then that Jewishness was passed down to their to their children and their children's children. So basically, if 4 or 3 grandparents were members of the Jewish religious community, you were then by definition yourself Jewish, regardless of what religion you practiced, right? That meant then racial status is ultimately determined by religious practice, which seems bizarre to me, right? But this is the function in Germany. And the Nazis left it to the courts to precisely define what kind of documentation was required to prove Jewishness. I mean, was it enough to have your grandfather buried in a Jewish cemetery rather than a Christian cemetery? Did that prove that he was by confession Jewish, and therefore he was one of the 3 or 4 counted as Jewish that would make you a Jew in German society, right? So the Nazis really weren't so keen on precise definitions. They left that to the legal experts to hash out and to work out over time. I really want to look more closely at the second Nuremberg race law, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. And it had a preamble that set out the legislative intent. So the intent of the legislator is very important when the courts are interpreting the law. And the way the courts interpreted the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, they said, well, clearly looking at this preamble that set out legislative intent, the legislature did not intend just to preserve German blood, protect German blood from Jewish blood mixing. They also protecting German honor. And they used that as a way to expand the application of this law beyond any possible intent the Nazis could conceive of. Because German honor was a much more flexible conception that they can use. Well, isn't waving at a Jew across the room, doesn't that violate German honor? Isn't that a violation of the law? Well, courts argued that it did, yes. So the law was involved in identifying Jews, in dispossessing Jews, and in the deportation of Jews. But it was also used not in a whole lot of cases, but a number of courts used their imagination and their knowledge of the law to combine statutes in order to get a death sentence for race defilement for the violations of the second Nuremberg law. This is one example of that case in 1942. It's Leo Katzenberger. He's Jewish. He's leader of the Jewish community of Nuremberg. His old friend, had a daughter named Irina Seiler. She moved into the city, into Nuremberg, and he promised the father that he would look after her. She's, under the law, she's defined as an Aryan German woman. They're accused of having an illicit sexual relation. Under the law, it's punishable by up to 2.5 years in penitentiary with forced labor. But the judge of the court was one of those who liked to combine laws in a way that came to an outcome that he wanted. Now, granted, they were already convicted not on the basis of police evidence, but on innuendo and rumor. And then he said, well, we can use this new statute that was passed in 1939 called the Decree Against Public Enemies that allowed judges to increase the criminal penalty up to death if the defendant used the conditions of war to further their crime. And Irena Seiler's husband was away at war. So the judge said, so clearly he used his absence away fighting at the front as a way to further his crime of race defilement with Irena Seiler. So he not only found Leo Katzenberger guilty of race defilement, but also declared him a public enemy and gave him a death sentence. And he was executed on June 3rd, 1942. Irena Seiler, well, they couldn't let her testimony stand that it was just a friendly relationship, that he was just helping her out because of her father. Her father asked him to. They accused her and found her guilty of perjury, and she was sentenced to 2 years in prison. So there's maybe a handful of these kind of cases where they really used a combination of laws in order to get to a death sentence for cases involving Jews, especially in race defilement cases. The other statute I think they used was the decree against habitual criminals. So that if you had multiple relationships with German women, if you were a Jewish man, you could then be found guilty of race defilement and you'd be declared a habitual criminal and sentenced to death. Looking at the medical profession, no, I'm moving very fast. I'm sorry, but there's something interesting about the medical profession. And again, they were also interested in the removal of Jewish doctors, nurses, and orderlies. That gave them more opportunity, more advancement. But there was a partnership between the medical professionals and the Nazi German state. Where Nazi ideology and medical public health policy, where they intersect, is in eugenics. And the Nazis made it really clear that they were going to rely on medical professionals to construct and enact and enforce public health policy in Nazi Germany. They wanted to create a healthier, more productive society using positive and negative eugenics measures. And the medical professionals were really excited about this. They were going to be called into the halls of power in order to help draft legislation that would then enact their ideas about how they can make society healthier. I mean, they even started talking about Hitler as doctor of the German nation, that somehow in a dictatorship was an opportunity to force people to live a healthier lifestyle. I mean, this is the source of the origin of that craze about public health, about exercise and long marches and calisthenics. It was this idea that you could force them to live a healthier lifestyle and have a healthier, more productive society. Where it became part of the killing program is in the so-called euthanasia killing program. This is the only signed document that we have with Adolf Hitler's name on it that authorized a killing program. And it's a letter on his personal stationery from his personal chancellery to his own doctor and doctor who works for the state, Ruler and Brandt. They're supposed to find like-minded doctors and call through the long-term care facilities in Germany for the physically and mentally impaired and decide who should be granted a mercy death and kill them, right? You can see that it's countersigned by the Minister of Justice, Dr. Gertner, in 1940. Gertner's not a Nazi. He's a nationalist from the German National People's Party. And his judges, prosecutors, informed him that they think there's a killing program going on because wards of the court are transferred out of their jurisdiction and then turn up dead. So he doesn't know what's going on. He goes to the chancellery and says, is there a secret killing program going on? And he said, well, yes, here's the authorization. And they hand it to him. This is why we have this document. This is why it's entered at Nuremberg, because Gertner dies in end of 1940, early 1941. And nobody thinks to look through his files when they're destroying evidence after the war. I mean, at the end of the war. So they find that document. And they need the authorization because this is patently against German law. Article 211 of the Criminal Code is offenses against life, and it specifically talks about euthanasia with or without the consent of the patient is the same as murder, right? Well, the Public Health Authority in the Ministry of the Interior sends this form to all the long-term care facilities and requires them to fill it out. Now, doctors in these long-term care facilities have experience with these kind of forms from World War I. They think, well, maybe it's a mobilization measure, so we better downplay the amount of useful work that the patients can do. And this is a time where work therapy was really, the in thing. So these institutions can't run without patient labor. So other doctors think, well, maybe this is a mobilization measure, so maybe I should downplay the amount of useful work that the patient can do. But what if it's determined the kind of rations you get? Then the more useful work they can do, the more rations they get. So they're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. In fact, these forms are used by a team of doctors, 3 doctors, to decide who should be part of the T4 killing program and who should be exempt from it. So these 3 doctors, they don't know each other. They're looking at the same forms, they have copies, and they mark in this box a plus or a minus depending on whether the patient should be included or excluded. And if 2 or 3 doctors agree, then that patient is included in the killing program, right? Well, excuse me, the killing program in this first stage is one of 6 facilities in towns throughout Germany. They're in the middle of German populations. They see what's going on here. It's hard not to see the smoke rising from that old psychiatric clinic that had been converted into a gassing installation. So patients are transferred there and then gassed with carbon monoxide gas, basically. And they understand what's going on, and it becomes then public knowledge. And Hitler has to cancel the systematic part of the program after about 70,000 patients are killed from these long-term care facilities. It doesn't mean the euthanasia killing program stopped. Instead, it was made more decentralized so that doctors and nurses were killing patients in clinics and hospitals all over Germany using their own judgment about who deserved life and who was what the Nazis called life unworthy of life, right? That became part and parcel of the medical ethic, that you needed to protect the community, not the individual. And the killing focus moved from doctors to nurses, because nurses were responsible for patient care and for the distribution of medication, so that they could then forcibly starve patients and then kill them with an overdose of medications. Now, I have to say that when the Nazis closed down the initial killing program, they had a cadre of professionals with expertise in the killing of large numbers of people in gas chambers. So about 100 of these medical professionals, doctors, nurses, orderlies, are transferred to occupied Poland. And they're the key personnel that set up the killing centers of Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. And many of them are also part of the medical personnel at Auschwitz. So they become key figures in the Holocaust because of their expertise in the process of killing large numbers of people with poison gas. I just can't get my head around this one. I mean, this is Dr. Ernst Wenzler. He's an internationally renowned pediatrician. He's invented an incubator to help save premature babies. He led the German effort to wipe out rickets amongst children. And he's one of these doctors that examines the forms to decide on the murder or the life of children in Germany. And we can see one of the victims that he signed off on will be. After the war, he just goes back to his hometown and opens another pediatric clinic. West German authorities eventually question him about his role in the euthanasia killing program, but he's never tried. But in this interrogation, this is something he said he thought he was doing what was best for Germany, that he was making a small contribution towards human progress. Brandt, one of the leaders and organizers of the killing program, saying, I did everything I did for Germany. And he's on the scaffold waiting to be hanged, and he simply says everything for Germany and is killed. So they think that they're doing the right thing, that they're helping create a healthier, more productive society by, doctors do triage all the time. Why shouldn't they be the ones to decide who lives and who dies? And they think they're being merciful. Looking at military professionals, and again, I'll go very quickly because I know I'm out of time. Again, they have a lot in common, Hitler and the German military, because of the defeat in World War I. They're hamstrung by the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was not able to have an army larger than 100,000. They couldn't have tanks. They were not allowed to have large capital ships. They're not allowed to have even an air force. Where they agreed absolutely together was the breaking of the Versailles Treaty, reinstitution of the draft in 1935, until suddenly now there's 500,000 men in the German army in 1935. And all that 100,000 man army permitted by Versailles, they all became officers. They all were promoted, got really quick promotions. The Nazis did hyper rearmament. which the military was absolutely ecstatic about, building the most modern equipment, most modern, even building the German Air Force from the ground up. So they really had overlap in breaking Versailles and rearming. But also the Nazis promised that they would create a more martial society again, because the military had been discredited by the loss in World War I. And the military leadership was very happy with that. I want to look at the Operation Barbarossa, the invasion against the Soviet Union in 1941. Behind German lines, 4 groups called Einsatzgruppen followed. They were supposed to pacify the area that that was liberated, so-called liberated by the German army. What they thought that meant was killing Jews, who were the natural, they assumed were the natural supports of the Soviet state. At first, just Jewish men, because they thought, well, if we're going to kill the supporters of the Soviet state, it should be Jewish men of military age. But they're told then by Berlin, no, we mean everybody. So women and children are included by July, and they're killing entire populations. And again, they're just 3,000 men, and that's not enough to kill the 2 million victims of the killing operation. And they involve then the police and local auxiliaries recruited from the local population. This was conceived from the very beginning as a war of annihilation, so that the command climate was such that this was going to be a brutal war with no holds barred. The justification was that the Soviet Union did not ratify the Geneva Convention or the Hague Convention, so Germany wasn't obligated to follow it. And that they saw this as a 4-pronged war, a war against the Slavs by the Germans, a war against communists by the Nazis, a war against the Asiatic flood from the East, Germany needed to protect Western civilization from the destructive influence of Slavic Jewish Bolshevism. Paired with that was the so-called Commissar Order, where the German army is ordered to kill outright Soviet ministers, Soviet government officials, Soviet political commissars, any Jews working for the in the Red Army or working for the Soviet government. And the army complied without any distinction, without any problems. And hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers that were captured, if they're determined after interrogation to be any in that category, they're shot. The war was destructive on a scale unheard of, not just because the Nazi war machine viewed Slavs as inherently inferior, useful only as forced laborers, but because they insisted that if they had to give up territory, they were going to leave nothing of value behind. So you're talking scorched earth all the way back to Germany and even into Germany proper. And that led to destruction on an unheard of scale. In the midst of all that is the cooperation between the army and the mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen. Even before the invasion, they agreed that the army would supply all the logistic support for the mobile killing squads. They would provide the transport, the housing, the food, the ammunition, the weaponry, everything that the mobile killing squads needed. And in exchange, these mobile killing squads would provide security behind the front and would pacify the local population. And here we see one of the reports about the operation of the mobile killing squads. They actually wrote these reports and sent them to their commanding officers of the mobile killing squads, who then sent them to Berlin. So they're recording how many Jews they're killing a day, not just how many, but how many men, how many women, how many children. And these reports were discovered in a paper mill after the war and used then to prosecute the mobile killing squad leadership before an American military tribunal at Nuremberg. But here we see the report from Einsatzgruppen C, so they're following Army Group South, and they're saying, well, as always, the relationship with the army is very cordial. If they're cooperating, I have no complaints about their cooperation. In fact, especially when we're talking about executions, the army is all on board, right? And we see evidence of that here, where German soldiers are being employed to guard Jewish men shortly before their massacre. So especially with military officers who are pro-Nazi, who are Nazi ideologues, people like von Reichenau in Army Group South, they don't order their men to kill Jews, but they don't mind. So that people on their own authority in the military are either involved in shooting Jews or organized to kill Jews, to assist in the killing of Jews of the security forces. So they're fully involved. So I'll just give you really quickly the four that took a different choice. This is a police commander, Wilhelm Creutzfeldt. In his district in Berlin was the new synagogue in Berlin. During Kristallnacht, he used an order from the Imperial Germany that said that it was a protected building and had to be protected, to force the SA to put out the fires, and he posted guards to prevent the building from being destroyed. And when called to task, why did he do that? He said, I followed the law. I was keeping public order and enforcing the law. Right, so a different decision is possible here. Here we have Martin Gauger, a young, promising prosecutor in Wuppertal, Germany. When asked to swear an oath to Hitler, he wrote a letter of resignation to his chief judge in Wuppertal and said, I can't do that, sorry. And he told his brother at the time that he couldn't swear an unlimited oath of loyalty and obedience to a man that's bound neither by the law nor the traditions of justice. He found it hard to find a job, but he's not arrested. He's not harassed by the Nazis. He's not persecuted in any way for his resignation. The Nazis don't want anybody working for them who don't want to work for him, right? So even as late as August 1934, with the death of Hindenburg, you could take a different decision. Here we have Judge Lothar Kreisig. I've already sort of indicated, this kind of different decision. He was one of the ones that discovered that wards of his court were being transferred and then turning up dead. And he went to the Ministry of Justice and said, I think there's a secret killing program going on. Basically, Freisler comes back with the authorization from Hitler and says, yes, there is, here it is. And Lothar Kreisig says, that's not a law. There's no provision against arbitrary action. There's no provision for appeal. There's no exception permitted. I'm going to file murder charges against Buller and Brandt. Rather than permit him to do that, he's pressured into retiring. So he submits his retirement papers and spends the rest of the war on his estate in Brandenburg. So the penalty for one of these professionals that are part of the establishment and taking a principled stand against the Nazis is not arrest and destruction. It's they're made irrelevant. They're removed from their posts and put someplace where they can't cause any public commotion about it. Dr. Fritz Krall, from the very beginning, he rejected the Nazi German state and this sort of alliance between medical professionals and the Nazis in public health policy. He helped a Jewish colleague when his colleague's practice was ordered dissolved. He took a wounded Jewish man during Kristallnacht to the Jewish hospital for care. He continued to treat Jewish patients even when the Nazi state banned it and said that only Jewish doctors could treat Jews. German doctors had to treat Germans. He ignored that completely. They had a friend during the war who was responsible for handing out ration cards, and they gave them extra ration cards. So they bought food with those ration cards and then sent their sons with bags of groceries to people who were hiding from the Nazis, including Jews in hiding. In fact, in 2006, the husband and wife, so Fritz and Margarete, they're declared righteous among nations by our colleagues at Yad Vashem for their willingness to risk their lives to help Jews. This is Lieutenant Battle. He's a military officer. He's in Pushemishol, and it's a relocation place where supplies have to be loaded off a European train and loaded onto a wide gauge train in order to bring it to the front. And he needed Jewish laborers to do that. So when the SS decided they were going to shoot and destroy the ghetto in Pushemishol, he posted infantry guards to prevent them from doing that, and even raided the ghetto and took 100 of his workers and their families into police protection. And he's authorized to do this because the military said that you can countermand any order from the security forces if it's military necessity. At the time, they're doing the offensive to Stalingrad. They needed Pushemishol to keep sort of offloading trains and onloading to wide gauge trains in order to keep the troops supplied in southern Russia. So the army stood behind his decision to block the SS from killing Jewish laborers. And that's the presentation for today. I hope you agree with me in the conclusion that without the cooperation, or at least tacit acceptance of these professions, the Holocaust would not have been possible. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over time. Please don't hurt me.
Not at all. It was absolutely fascinating, and thank you. And we have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. There are many of them. And when you are unpacking those professions and the fact that they were not ideologues, they were, ordinary people that obeyed the law changed, they obeyed the changing law. People that were never killers before the war, this period, and they never killed after, but for this period, many of them, through their professions, became killers or assisting the killing process.
And for me, the most fascinating part was they thought they were doing the same job they've always done up until the point they were required to kill somebody. Because killing is never part of your profession, even if you're a military officer. I mean, that's not the purpose of being in the military.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll never forget once in Rwanda, interviewing a man that said, I was in the army. The minute I saw that they're killing women and children, I realized that this is not right. And I had to do something about it. He was a rescuer. So that point of moving from one to the other, I think, is very, very, very interesting. And Will, there are lots of questions, but I chose, because of the limited time, maybe some questions, first of all, about the police. And Bob is asking, were the police forced to cooperate with the Nazis, or did the police choose to work with the Nazis because the needs, or was there any, how did it work that they moved into this cooperation with the Nazis and the SS?
I think there's two things to think about that are key here. One, on one hand, Hitler recognized that he needed their professionals, especially police professionals. They knew policing, they knew police procedure, they knew the law, they knew the community. He had to work really with the police, really very closely. And he made it a decision in a public statement saying that loyalty is not key here. Professionalism is what's key here. You have to have the ability to do the job in order to get the position, right? So, that already went a long way to alleviating concerns amongst the police that they were going to be replaced, basically. The second thing that's really key here is that the police recognize the Nazi German state as legitimate. The police don't resign just because of changing government. They view themselves as neutral professionals applying the law even-handedly to everyone in society, right? They don't make political decisions. That's the political oversight of the police. And at the time, for their misfortune, the political oversight of the police are people like Heydrich, Himmler, and Goering, right? So but the police aren't supposed to judge the political oversight. They're just supposed to enforce the law and enact and safeguard the streets. So the fact that we expect police to resign because this new government, that's not something they would see as normal. That's abnormal.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we look at diplomats during the Holocaust, and we really speak so highly about those diplomats that went against their government, like the Sosa Mendes and Sugihara and so on. And we do judge those that did not follow, the policy that was wrong. But with the police, we just say, well, the laws changed and the government changed and they followed the government of the day. So I'm just, and there are a few questions about it, about what the archive is actually telling us about this police, relationship with the SS.
So much they could rationalize as doing their normal duty, maintaining public order, crowd control, enforcing the law. That doesn't change whether it's the Imperium or whether it's the Republic or whether it's the Nazis. But when they get the order to kill unarmed civilians, especially women and children, that's not something they can rationalize as part of their job, right? And then the reaction there, if you look at Christopher Browning's work, for example, is really illuminating because, 10 to 20% of them say, this isn't police work, I'm not doing this. Or that, this makes me sick, I can't do this. Both were really accepted by the Nazi German state as, okay, that's fine. As long as you don't say this is wrong, you can go do something else. We'll make do with the people who will do it, and they'll get the job done anyway, right? So there's that leeway, that open space. I just wish more people would have said, this isn't police work, I can't do this.
And is the same happening in the military? So when, the military is asked to do it for example, in Greece, it was only the military. It wasn't the SS in certain places like Yanina and others. Do you find the same phenomena?
It depended on command climate. It depended on who, ultimately their local commander was and how he felt about the whole situation. Somebody like Hoepner, who a priori says, this is going to be a brutal war, but then later, hinders enactment or enforcement of the Commissar order, because he thinks that will undermine military discipline. Now, did he really not want to kill Soviet commissars, or did he really believe that this would then undermine his authority with his own men? I can't say, because in the context of the Nazi dictatorship, you can't openly say what you think, right? There's kind of language that's permitted in public without any kind of consequences, and most professionals especially know the line that they cannot cross. You can say, I can't do this because I'm weak, but you can't say, I won't do this because it's wrong. Then you get all the negative consequences of the state crashing down upon you.
And of course, we need to of course, take into account the fear, that is growing as the years passing, and the brutalization and the extremism that is moving as the years are passing.
I can't discount fear, but I don't think it's as big a factor as most people assume, because we forget that these professionals are part of the establishment. They're used to wielding power, to having the respect of the public and their co-workers and the government. They don't see themselves. I can't imagine a judge sitting on the Supreme Court, the least Nazi court in Germany, ever fearing that he would wind up in a concentration camp. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah. So there is a question that is across all those professions by Eleanor, and she's really asking, about the core of anti-Semitism, in these professionals. She's trying to understand, was anti-Semitism playing any role in the compliance of those professionals, in their alignment to the Nazi Party?
Anti-Semitism is definitely a factor for the true believers, because anti-Semitism was a core value of the Nazi elite, of the Nazi leadership. For sort of those who weren't enamored of the Nazis, anti-Semitism is still part of the pattern, part of the picture. But it's not, I don't think it's the same kind of eliminationist anti-Semitism that some scholars are talking about. I think it's much more of the traditional anti-Semitism where, at least I've seen this in my own research amongst the legal profession, they'll saying, well, yeah, a Jew wants to be a lawyer, but he should specialize in trade law, because that's what Jews do. It's that kind of anti-Semitism. It's not, they're not German and they can't ever be lawyers, they need to leave Germany. I think it's only amongst the Nazis, the Nazi elite. But anti-Semitism, the propaganda war that the Nazis really won was to convince ordinary Germans, to make part of German culture, that Jews could not be German, that they were different from Germans, and that they were the natural enemies of Germans. I think the Nazis were successful in convincing people of that. That's why I think these police battalions are mobilized to deport Jews, because they see it, well, we're deporting from Germany enemies who live amongst us. We'll make Germany more secure. We'll make Germany more safe. We'll make the German community more safe. And isn't that the job of the police?
Absolutely. We have time probably for just two more questions. And Bob is asking, can you reflect on those professionals that you did give us a few examples, but maybe percentage-wise, or what was your sense of professionals that disagreed or protested against the Nazis in the different professions?
Okay.
And what's the difference between the professions?
Here's the biggest problem with that. For example, if you were a practitioner of civil law and you handled cases that didn't involve any Jewish participation in the trial, then the trials happened as they always happened in Germany, that the Nazis really didn't have a big impact. If it was an area of law that Hitler and the Nazi leadership didn't care about, like trade law, contract law, if it didn't involve Jews, it all went normal. So, a judge, a lawyer, a prosecutor, or state's attorney who specialized in civil law in cases that didn't involve Jews in the case at all, their job stayed the same, and it was the way it always was. So do we count them amongst those who weren't involved in the Nazi system, who weren't contributing to the stabilization of the Nazi regime or the Nazi racial agenda? Or do we count them as tacit participators? Can you say tacit? Is that possible to be a tacit participator? They're participating in the system, but not in Nazi persecution. And by participating in the system under the Nazis, they're aiding the Nazi German state. So I'll say that as precisely as possible. I do know, since I was involved in establishing these seminars with American professionals in those same professions, we looked for people that made different choices, and it is darn hard to find. So I, for the life of me, can't find, and I don't think the German judiciary can either, because they've tried, anybody else in the legal profession that refused to swear the oath. Only Martin Galger. Again, 50% of the medical professions, doctors, nurses, medical orderlies, joined the Nazi movement, joined the Nazi party even. So, to find just one case where a German, doctor said, I'm not dealing with any of this. This is nonsense. I'm going to keep doing what I've always done. A patient who comes to me is my patient, period. I don't care whether they're Jewish or Christian or what. That's extraordinarily rare.
Yeah, that is quite sobering, actually, that reflection. So as we're running out of time, maybe just to share the request from Deborah that is asking for recommendations of books, of articles, of links about the profession's complicity with the Nazi killing program, and then Ellen can share that with the recording. If you don't mind to create that list, I think people will really benefit from the richness of your knowledge and to direct us to the right places. And then lots of other comments and questions, but maybe just, maybe to reflect, Roberta just wrote excellent, presentation. And she's saying, I am an attorney, and I was thinking about the important role of the judiciary and of laws, in this system that we know as the Nazi system in the Holocaust. And I just draw the attention to everyone, if you are in Berlin next time ever, and can go to the new exhibition at the Jewish Museum that have a very, very interesting exhibition about the laws. And each one of those laws in a huge kind of a display until laws that were passed even in 1945. And I think that brings back to, Will, what you said, that it was all honed on the cooperation with the professions, but all honed on the laws. I did not do anything against the law. This is the law of the country. I'm obeying the law.
One of my colleagues pointed out to me that one of the problems is the requirement to be neutral professionals, that professional ethics must be rooted in democratic values. Otherwise, you get a situation like in the Nazi situation where you have a government that you think is legitimate, but orders you to do something that's an anathema. What do you do? That's the ultimate dilemma. What do you do?
Yeah, and it's a great lesson for our world today, our very wounded world today, of what do you do when the law is, inhuman and against really humanity. So you gave us so much, to think about, and hopefully you'll send us a lot of material that we can dive into this topic deeper. And I really want to thank you, as always, learned so much from you, Will, and on behalf of all of us, just a real grateful thanks for your depth of knowledge and your willingness to share that with us. And thank you for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for all the work you guys do.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. You're great guys to work with. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And Ellen, back to you.
Thank you. And I will formally close us out for today. Thank you, Tali, for stepping in when I had my technology snafu a little bit earlier. I want to formally thank you, Tali and William, for this fascinating discussion. As promised, once I receive those resources from William, I will make sure that I send those in our follow-up email. We hope that you will join us next week on the 21st for Michael Berenbaum's final session in his series on discussions of America and the Holocaust. As a reminder, CWB is taking a short break from our programmatic offerings over the summer months here in Pittsburgh. We'll return in September, and we'll continue with our next session on this ongoing series, The Holocaust as an Interdisciplinary Tapestry. To sign up for these events and more, please visit our website at www.cwbpgh.org. We hope that you all stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next week or in the fall. Bye, everyone.